He was a ruthless mafia boss, an untouchable figure in the world of power, until a young girl, barely 7 years old, intervened and changed his life forever. The lobby of the Grand Aurelia Hotel gleamed with opulence, the air thick with the scent of wealth. Marble floors reflected the golden glow of chandeliers, and attendants, dressed in crisp uniforms, moved with precision, as though rehearsed in their duties. Guests conversed in hushed tones, their laughter and chatter mingling in a symphony of languages, their jewelry catching the light with every movement, serving as a reminder of their elevated status in society. Amidst all the luxury and extravagance, one man stood out as much as the hotel itself, a symbol of power. Michel Duval, the mafia boss known for his ruthlessness, had walked through countless corridors of wealth like this one. His presence alone made people turn their heads before they even recognized him. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with an aura of confidence that only comes from years of dominance, he moved with a purposeful stride. His meticulously styled dark hair framed a face of intense blue eyes, eyes that had dominated boardrooms and silenced adversaries across the globe. That day, he wore a perfectly tailored gray suit, sharp and imposing, exuding an aura of invincibility. Michel was in the hotel for a reason. He was preparing to meet a group of European investors whose decision would dictate the next decade of his empire's growth. The stakes were high, worth billions, but for Michel, it was just another day in his relentless pursuit of more power, more control, and more wealth. Michel had left nothing to chance in his preparations. Every document was reviewed and re-reviewed, each clause in the contract studied until it was burned into his mind. As he sat in the conference room, surrounded by his legal team and advisors, his voice was calm, measured, issuing final instructions as his mind calculated the next steps with surgical precision. In his world, nothing was left to uncertainty. There was no room for surprises. But outside that room, fate was quietly preparing to throw everything off course. Far from the polished luxury of the boardroom, in a shadowed corner of the hotel, a little girl sat, waiting. She wasn't a part of this world of expensive suits, diamonds, and high-stakes negotiations. Emily was just a 7-year-old girl, with her long, unruly blonde hair tied haphazardly, her white dress already starting to show the signs of a long day, and a denim jacket far too big for her small frame. Her shoes were scuffed, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her worn backpack. Emily's world was one of waiting, waiting for her mother, who worked as a maid in the hotel, often for long hours. She had learned to be invisible, blending into the background, observing the ebb and flow of hotel guests without ever making her presence known. She listened more than she spoke, shrinking into the shadows and watching the world around her. She had learned the languages of the people, the ebb and flow of their conversations, even though she was rarely seen. This was Emily's life, quiet, unnoticed. But she made a game of it, imagining the lobby as a grand stage where everyone else played their parts, completely unaware of the little girl watching them. That morning, as Michel prepared to secure another major deal, Emily's small world shifted. She had wandered closer to the service corridors, where the staff moved quickly, their voices hushed, carrying trays and linens behind the scenes. It was there, just outside the service entrance, hidden from view, that she overheard something that shouldn't have been said where she could hear. Two men in uniform spoke in a low, conspiratorial tone, their words drifting toward her like a whispered secret. They were speaking French, a language Emily knew well, having learned it from her grandmother, who had taught her the beautiful, lilting sounds of the language during quiet afternoons spent in the warmth of home. Although she couldn't catch every word, Emily heard enough to understand the dangerous message: eliminate him when he's alone today. She pressed herself closer to the wall, her heart pounding in her chest as the men laughed quietly, passing by her without a glance. Her mind raced, piecing the information together with terrifying speed. They weren't talking about just anyone, they were talking about Michel Duval, the mafia boss she had seen in newspapers and television. These weren't guards, they were predators waiting for their moment. Her hands shook as she gripped her backpack tighter. She could run and tell her mother. She could hide, pretend she hadn't heard anything. But something inside her refused to stay silent. She remembered her grandmother's teachings: words had power. Words could save or destroy. And she couldn't let this man's life be destroyed by silence. With a courage that belied her small stature, Emily turned and ran toward the conference rooms, her footsteps echoing in the quiet halls as she entered the room where the powerful were about to meet. As the doors opened, the stillness of the meeting room was shattered by her tiny voice. She stood in the doorway, a frail figure trembling with fear, but also with purpose. When she spoke, her words sliced through the calm like a sharp blade. "They want to hurt you." Michelle's world, carefully constructed and flawlessly controlled, cracked. The Mafia boss, a man who had built an empire on his ability to control everything, felt a chill run through his veins at the words of this child. His usual composure faltered for a brief moment, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of uncertainty. The room fell into stunned silence as Emily's warning hung in the air, her fear palpable, her sincerity undeniable. Michel, known for his ability to detect lies and manipulation in seconds, found himself uncertain. His advisors were confused, some frowned, others began to rise, preparing to remove the child. But Michel raised a hand to stop them, his eyes fixed on her, a realization slowly dawning. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a child's imagination running wild. This was a warning. With deliberate calm, Michel stood and walked toward her, ignoring the concerned protests of his colleagues. He crouched slightly to meet her gaze, and he saw the genuine terror in her wide blue eyes. The small hands clutching her oversized jacket trembled. "What did you say?" His voice, usually firm, held a note of uncharacteristic softness. Emily's voice was barely a whisper as she repeated the chilling words, "Eliminate him when he's alone today." Her voice broke through the tension in the room, the urgency in her tone making it clear that she was not just a scared child. She had heard something she wasn't meant to hear, and she was trying to warn him. The air thickened with the weight of her words, and Michel felt the truth settle in his chest like a lead weight. This wasn't a mere coincidence. This was real. It wasn't just a child's fantasy or a joke, it was a warning of something far darker. Before he could process further, the door behind them opened, and one of the supposed security guards entered. His eyes flicked toward Emily and then fixed on Michel, a look of too much interest, too much focus. Michel's instincts screamed at him, and for the first time, he understood that something was amiss. Without hesitation, Michel reached for Emily's hand, pulling her toward him, shielding her behind his own body. His voice snapped like a command as he ordered his aide to clear the room and bring in the head of real security. His colleagues erupted in confusion, but Michel remained focused, his attention fixed on the imposter in the doorway. The professional security team arrived swiftly, weapons drawn, their movements swift and controlled. The fake guard was subdued in moments, his cover blown. It was not just one man, but part of a much larger, well-orchestrated plot. Michel would later learn that the assassination attempt had been in the works for weeks, meticulously planned to strike when he was momentarily vulnerable. But thanks to a 7-year-old girl, Michel Duval, the ruthless Mafia boss, was saved, and his life would never be the same again. In that pivotal moment, everything hinged on the small, trembling girl whose sharp instincts and quiet courage had unknowingly altered the course of a life, and possibly even saved it. As the immediate danger subsided and the hotel erupted into chaos, with frantic phone calls and guests being swiftly escorted to safety, Michel stood apart, still clutching Emily's tiny hand. She looked exhausted, her cheeks flushed from the ordeal, and her blue eyes seemed far too large for her small face, but through it all, she did not release his grip. He observed her quietly, wondering what cosmic twist had brought this child into his path. The man who had always believed he could control every variable, who had outmaneuvered rivals and anticipated every move, now stood before a situation that had completely blindsided him. As he knelt before her again, gentler this time, he asked the question that had been burning in his mind, "How did you know?" Emily's voice wavered as she shared her simple explanation, admitting that she had overheard the men speaking French, a language her grandmother had taught her in years gone by. Her explanation was straightforward, childlike in its honesty, but to Michel, it carried a weight that settled heavily on him. He had weathered corporate betrayals, survived power struggles, and faced ruthless adversaries, but none of them had ever touched him in the way this little girl had. In a few short moments, she had saved him, not through force, wealth, or influence, but through instinct and courage. As he looked at her, Michel realized that everything he had focused on, the meeting, the billion-dollar deal, was now insignificant. The powerful investors waiting outside the conference room no longer mattered. What mattered now was Emily. The girl who had shifted the trajectory of his life, and the question of why a child like her, unnoticed and unprotected, had found herself in this world of suits, power, and polished smiles. The chaos began to calm, and the immediate danger was declared neutralized. Yet Michel's mind raced. He was no longer thinking about his empire or the wealth that had consumed his life for years. He had made a decision, one that surprised even him. He would not let this girl slip back into invisibility, not after what she had done. He would know her name, her story, and he would understand why fate had chosen her to break through the fortress he had so carefully constructed around himself. As he walked Emily out of the conference room, her small hand still enveloped in his, he sensed that everything in his life was about to change. Michel had always thought fear was a weakness he had outgrown, a sentiment abandoned in his youth and replaced by ruthless discipline. But after the events of that day, with the impostors now captured and his security team scrambling to assess the breach, Michel found himself realizing that true fear did not stem from threats against him, it was born from the realization of what could have happened if he had ignored the warning of the little girl who had sat silently in his suite, her presence more powerful than any enemy. She sat in the oversized armchair, her small body wrapped in her denim jacket, trying to shrink into it as if it could protect her from the world around her. Despite the fear she had experienced, she did not cry, nor did she fidget. She was still, watching the room with the same intense focus that had saved Michel earlier. It was as if she had already learned that silence, in moments like these, was often a matter of survival. After dismissing the last of his advisors, Michel closed the door, leaving just the two of them alone for the first time since their paths had crossed. Gone were the shouting voices and the sense of urgency, only the hum of the city far below and the stillness of Emily remained. Michel poured himself a glass of water, his hand lingering on the rim longer than it should have, betraying the unease he fought so hard to hide. Turning toward her, he finally asked, "What is your name?" She lifted her chin slightly, her voice soft but steady as she responded, "Emily." He repeated the name quietly, grounding it in his mind. To him, it felt different from the countless names he encountered daily, those of executives, investors, and rivals. There was a weight to it, a significance he could not ignore. Michel asked her more questions, speaking softly, careful not to overwhelm her, and little by little, her story began to unfold. Her mother worked at the hotel, cleaning rooms and working double shifts to make ends meet. Emily often waited in the hotel's grand lobbies, wandering the halls, unnoticed by the world that moved around her. Her father, she said quietly, was gone, no name, no explanation, just a shadow. Emily spoke with hesitation, her small hands fidgeting in her lap, but with each word she spoke, Michel found himself drawn deeper into her world, one that existed on the edges of wealth and power, a world of survival while the powerful moved around her, oblivious. He listened longer than he intended, his heart tightening as she explained how her grandmother had taught her French. How the lullabies and bedtime stories had once seemed so trivial, yet those same words had saved a life today. For the first time in years, Michel found himself at a loss for words. He had spent his life mastering the art of silence in boardrooms, using every moment of pause for calculation and strategy. But now, in the silence between them, he knew that this was the moment to simply listen. As Emily lowered her gaze, Michel's mind turned again to the world she had spoken of, one of isolation and quiet suffering. The exhaustion in her small frame, the weariness of a child who had lived in the shadows of wealth, struck him deeply. He wondered how many times she had waited alone, unnoticed by men like him, who were too focused on their own reflections to see the lives of those around them. When the head of security entered to brief him on the captured attackers, Michel waved him off and asked instead how this infiltration had been missed. How had they failed to notice what a child had seen? The security officer stammered, offering reassurances and explanations, but Michelle's icy stare silenced him. When the door closed again, his focus returned to Emily. His mind raced, not with thoughts of betrayal from his enemies, but with a question: how had fate placed this girl in my path? As evening fell and the city outside the windows darkened, Michelle ordered dinner for them both. When the plates arrived, Emily hesitated, her small hands hovering over the food as if unsure whether she was allowed to take it. Michelle gently nudged the plate closer, and she began to eat slowly, carefully, as if rationing each bite. Michelle watched her, a deep ache settling in his chest as he realized that the quiet discipline in her eating was something he had never seen in the world he inhabited, a world of excess and waste. Later, as Emily dozed in the chair, finally succumbing to the exhaustion that had overtaken her, Michelle watched her longer than he should have. The rise and fall of her small shoulders, the way her hair fell across her cheek, the faint traces of fear still lingering on her face. He realized that her presence had unsettled him in ways no rival ever had. For the first time in his life, Michel Duval understood a truth that had always eluded him: his empire, his wealth, and his carefully crafted life could be torn apart in an instant. And sometimes, salvation came from the most unexpected places. As he stood by the window, staring out at the glittering skyline that had always symbolized his success, he admitted something to himself he had never dared to before. He owed his life not to his empire, not to his fortune, but to a 7-year-old girl who had been invisible to his world, until she wasn't. And in that moment, he knew that his life had changed forever. The morning light spilled over the city, casting a glow on the skyline that Michel Duval had built, his monuments to discipline and ruthlessness. Yet today, they appeared hollow, their grandeur reduced to mere glass and steel. He had survived an assassination attempt, and though his enemies were apprehended and his empire remained unshaken, nothing felt the same. In a world where power, influence, and wealth had once been his sole focus, Michel found himself preoccupied with something far more significant than the deals awaiting him. His mind kept returning to the image of a little girl, sitting in an armchair far too large for her, her small body weighed down by exhaustion that did not match her age. Her blue eyes held a quiet courage that far outstripped that of most men Michel had encountered in his career. At the office, his board of directors waited for him, their faces a mixture of concern and impatience, expecting him to address the breach in security, reassure investors, and strategize how best to handle the media frenzy that was sure to follow. But Michel was not interested in any of that. He opened the meeting with a question that threw everyone into silence: had any of you noticed the child in the hotel lobby? The little girl who had been waiting patiently while her mother worked. The girl who had risked everything to warn him. The executives shifted uncomfortably, exchanging confused glances. None of them had noticed her. To them, children in hotel corridors were as invisible as the cleaning staff. Michel's voice hardened as he pointed out the irony: a 7-year-old girl had seen what his trained professionals had missed. The empire he had built on precision and control had been saved not by wealth or power, but by someone overlooked by everyone, including the very people who served him. His words cut through the room, and several directors tried to steer the conversation back to business, but Michel silenced them with a look that made it clear his mind was elsewhere. For the first time, the directors understood: Michel was not interested in their strategies or reassurances. His focus had shifted, and this wasn't some passing distraction. He demanded accountability from his security team, firing 2 senior officers on the spot when they failed to answer basic questions about how imposters had infiltrated his empire so easily. But it wasn't just about the security breach, it was about something far deeper. Michel demanded to know how it was possible that a child had been left unprotected in the very place that should have kept her safe. His fury wasn't directed at her mother, Margaret, but at the system that had allowed this to happen. No one had answers. They stammered, offering weak excuses, but Michel's anger was sharp and relentless. When the meeting ended, Michel didn't linger over contracts or entertain anxious investors. Instead, he instructed his driver to take him to the part of the city he had never really noticed before, the part of the city that seemed a world apart from his own. He was heading to the crumbling apartment block where Emily and her mother lived. The contrast was jarring. Only hours earlier, Michelle had been sitting at a polished conference table worth more than the combined rent of families living in this building. Now, as he climbed the creaking stairs to their apartment, he felt the weight of that disparity press heavily on him. Margaret Hayes opened the door, looking fragile, her face pale from exhaustion. For a moment, she seemed ready to apologize, as if her mere existence in such a place was some sort of offense. But before she could speak, Emily appeared behind her, clutching the fabric of her mother's sleeve. When Michel saw her, a strange sensation tightened in his chest. The fear of the day before had not truly left him until he saw that she was safe. Inside, the apartment was clean but sparse. Every corner revealed the strain of a life lived in survival mode. A small table sat by the window, covered in unpaid bills. In the corner, a thin mattress served as Emily's bed. Margaret stammered as she explained, her voice tinged with guilt, that she had never meant for her daughter to be in danger, that Emily had never been meant to overhear anything. Michel listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. But inside, his anger wasn't directed at Margaret, it was directed at the world he had helped create, a world where women like her were forced to work themselves to exhaustion while their children lingered in hotel lobbies, unnoticed. Emily stayed close to her mother, watching Michel carefully, her blue eyes cautious. But when he crouched down to meet her at eye level, he spoke quietly, thanking her for saving his life. Her eyes widened in surprise. It wasn't the grand, commanding tone of a billionaire addressing someone beneath him. It was simply a man acknowledging that a debt had been paid, a debt that could never be repaid. Emily nodded slightly, and though she didn't speak, her small shoulders relaxed as if the recognition alone had lifted a weight. When Michel left that evening, he carried with him an unease that no amount of wealth could soothe. Back in his penthouse, as he stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, he looked out at the glittering skyline. It had always been a symbol of his success, but now all he could see in the reflection was the shadow of a little girl who had risked everything to warn him, and the fragile world she returned to. For the first time, Michel understood that his empire, his fortune, and his carefully crafted life were not as invulnerable as he had believed. His greatest challenge was no longer about conquering markets, it was about deciding what kind of man he wanted to be in the wake of a child's bravery. That night, long after the city had quieted, Michel lay awake in his bed. The weight of his thoughts pressed heavily on him. He made a decision that surprised even himself. He would not let Emily slip back into invisibility. Her life had crossed paths with his, and whether he was ready or not, he knew that he would never be the same. The days following his visit to Margaret and Emily's apartment refused to leave his mind. No matter how many hours he buried himself in meetings or reports, his thoughts kept returning to them. His empire, the machine he had built, continued to run without him. But for the first time in his career, Michel found himself stepping away from it. He began canceling meetings, arriving late to board sessions, and leaving early, making excuses that would have been unthinkable just days ago. His colleagues and investors whispered, some concerned, others suspicious, but Michel barely noticed. He was no longer focused on spreadsheets and stock prices. Instead, his thoughts drifted to the unpaid bills on Margaret's table, the mattress in the corner of their apartment, and the eyes of a little girl who ate cautiously as though food might disappear at any moment. Michel began returning to the apartment, sometimes under the guise of checking on Margaret's health, other times without explanation. Margaret's health worsened with each visit. Her cough grew worse, her frame becoming smaller and frilier. She always tried to greet him politely, masking the depth of her suffering with a thin smile, but Michel saw through it. Margaret never asked for help directly, but her silence spoke volumes, carrying the weight of every unspoken plea. Emily, too, revealed more of herself each time. At first, she barely spoke, but over time, she began to trust him more. She brought him her drawings, shared small details about her life, and even laughed occasionally, each laugh a small act of rebellion against the sadness that surrounded her. One evening, Michel sat with Emily while Margaret rested in the other room. Emily was coloring on a scrap of paper, her tongue sticking out in concentration. When Michel asked what she was drawing, she held it up proudly. It was a house, with 3 figures in front of it, a tall man, a woman with long hair, and a small girl, holding both of their hands. She whispered softly that it was the family she wanted. Her innocence hit Michel harder than anything he had ever faced in his life. For years, he had defined himself by towers of steel and glass, by balance sheets and headlines. And yet, here was a child, reminding him that none of that mattered compared to the simplicity of belonging. He reached out and gently smoothed the paper, as though it were something fragile he couldn't afford to damage. The media soon caught wind of his repeated visits to a rundown neighborhood. Speculation spread quickly. Some accused him of hiding a scandal, others said it was a publicity stunt. Michel ignored it all. For him, it wasn't about image. It wasn't about control or power. It was about the quiet trust in Emily's eyes, the way she smiled when she believed he wouldn't disappear, and the brief moments of joy he saw in Margaret's face when she realized her daughter was laughing again. And for the first time in his life, Michel knew he was no longer just a man of wealth and power. He was someone changed by the bravery of a child, and he would never be the same. The silence that once enveloped his vast, cold rooms now felt like a weight on his chest, a stifling emptiness that had not been there before. His sleek, sterile penthouse, once a sanctuary from the constant demands of the world, had turned into a hollow shell. The skyline he had built, his empire of glass and steel, now seemed like little more than a facade. He had survived an assassination attempt, and the immediate threat was gone. His enemies had been captured, his empire remained intact, and yet, for the first time in his life, Michel found himself questioning the worth of all that he had built. He stood at the window late into the night, gazing at the glittering lights of the city. The towers that represented his triumph seemed like cold, lifeless structures now. He thought about the child, the fragile, courageous girl who had somehow found her way into his life. Emily had risked everything to save him. And despite his fortune and control over every other aspect of his existence, he had failed to protect her. The weight of that failure, of not shielding her from the very system he had built, gnawed at him. A decision, one that surprised even him, began to form in his mind. The next morning, Michel called his lawyers. When they answered, he gave them instructions that were met with stunned silence. He wanted them to begin the legal processes to assume guardianship of Emily, should anything happen to her mother, Margaret. The lawyers were taken aback, voicing concerns about the complications, the potential media frenzy, and the endless legal hurdles. Michel silenced them with one chilling glance. He wasn't asking for their opinion, he was giving them an order. For years, he had built walls around himself, walls that no one could breach. But Emily, in a single moment of bravery, had shattered those walls. She had saved him, and in doing so, she had changed everything. There was no going back now. Later that evening, without informing anyone at his company, Michel drove straight to Margaret's apartment. He hadn't planned to stop by, but once there, he knocked softly on the door. Emily opened it, her blue eyes lighting up with surprise and relief. She didn't hesitate to let him in. Inside, the apartment was small and modest, a far cry from the lavish offices and conference rooms Michel was used to. Margaret appeared soon after, her frail body moving slowly but with a sharpness in her gaze that betrayed both gratitude and fear. She tried to thank him for all he had done, the medical care, the rent, the food, but Michel stopped her gently. He told her, in a soft, steady voice, that what he had done was nothing compared to what she and Emily had given him. He promised her, with a quiet conviction that even surprised himself, that Emily would never be left alone, not as long as he lived. Margaret's lips trembled, and her eyes filled with tears. For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of his promise hung heavy in the room, unspoken but understood. When Michel left later that evening, he knew something had changed inside him. The man who had once defined himself by wealth and power was no longer the same. In his place was someone who had been irrevocably changed by the courage of a child. In the days that followed, everything seemed different. The world around him spun on, as it always did, but Michel felt as though his life had shifted onto a new path. He continued to manage his empire, signing contracts, attending meetings, making decisions that moved millions. But his mind was never fully in the room. More often than not, while his executives spoke about projections and profit margins, Michel found himself thinking of Emily, the way she hesitated to laugh, as if joy was something she had to ask permission for, or how Margaret's persistent cough echoed in their small apartment long after her smile had faded. For the first time in his life, Michel felt helpless. Money, which had always been his weapon and shield, could not reverse time or heal Margaret's illness. It could buy the best doctors and the most comfortable beds, but it could not restore the strength Margaret was losing each day. Day by day, Michel visited them whenever he could. And as time went on, he realized that his presence was no longer an intrusion, but an expectation. Emily began waiting for him, her face lighting up when she heard his knock, her guarded smile slowly blossoming into something freer when she realized he had returned again. She would show him her drawings, her worn-out books, and small treasures like buttons or stones she had collected. Michel listened with a patience that surprised even him, losing himself in her world of simple joys. In those moments, he was no longer the CEO of a vast corporation. He was simply a man learning to be present, to see the world through the eyes of a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly. Margaret, on the other hand, seemed to retreat further from the world each day. She tried to mask her fatigue, still summoning the energy to prepare meals and fold laundry, but Michel could see the tremor in her hands, the shallow breath she took after completing even the smallest task. He insisted she rest, taking over the chores himself. Emily giggled at the sight of a man in a designer suit struggling to cook pasta or fold blankets awkwardly. Margaret would watch them with a soft expression, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and sadness, as though she knew she was witnessing the last vestiges of a life she would soon leave behind. At the office, whispers began to spread. Employees noticed his changing behavior, the way he left earlier than usual, how he cancelled late-night meetings, and how his once cold efficiency had softened. Speculation ran rampant. Some thought he was distracted by a scandal, others that he had found a woman who now occupied his time. But no one knew the truth. Michel ignored the gossip. For the first time in his career, he did not care how he was perceived. The choices he was making mattered in a way they never had before. He had built towers that pierced the skyline, but none of them compared to the fragile bond he was forming with the little girl who had saved his life. One night, after another long day of balancing business with visits to Margaret's apartment, Michel arrived to find Emily sitting beside her mother's bed, reading softly from a children's book. Margaret lay there, her eyes half closed, a faint smile on her lips. When Emily noticed him, she quickly climbed into his lap, as though she had been waiting for him to arrive. Michael felt her small body relax against him, and in that moment, he was no longer just the untouchable billionaire. He was simply a man who had been changed by love. Margaret's eyes met his, and in that gaze, he saw both gratitude and resignation. Later, when Emily had fallen asleep, Margaret whispered to him, her voice cracking, that she was not afraid for herself, but terrified for her daughter. She confessed that she had nothing to leave Emily but love, and that love, she feared, would not be enough to keep her safe. Michel listened in silence, his throat tight. Then, without hesitation, he told her that Emily would never be alone, not while he was alive. He promised her that he would take care of Emily, not out of charity or obligation, but from a place deeper than that. Margaret nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. In that moment, Michel knew that promises were no longer mere words to him. They had become a responsibility, a truth he could not escape. In the days that followed, Michel made the decision to push forward with guardianship. He contacted his lawyers to expedite the process, instructing them to prepare for every legal complication, every battle that would come. He would fight for Emily, no matter how messy it became, because the thought of her being lost to the system was unbearable. Michel had faced ruthless competitors in hostile markets, but this fight felt personal. He knew he would not lose. That night, as he stood once again before the windows of his penthouse, looking out at the glittering skyline, Michel no longer saw the reflection of his empire. Instead, he saw a man who had been irrevocably changed, a man whose life was no longer his own, because he had made a promise to a child who had saved him. The once comforting silence of Michel's expansive rooms now felt suffocating, oppressive. The fortress he had built to shield himself from the world's demands had turned into an emptiness he could no longer ignore. It lacked the presence of the fragile life that had become intertwined with his own, the little girl who had trusted him. That night, as he stared out at the glittering skyline from his penthouse, he wondered whether everything he had worked for was truly worth anything. He had once believed in the value of his empire, but now, as the weight of his responsibility to Emily settled in, he found himself questioning everything. His world, once constructed of steel and glass, now felt like it had shifted, and Michel found himself helplessly tangled in something far more significant than profits or power. The promise he had made to Emily and her mother had bound him to something greater, something worth more than any tower he had built. And though he had no idea what the future held, he knew he would face it differently, because for the first time, he had something worth fighting for. The day Margaret passed away was etched in Michel's memory with a clarity so sharp it seemed to cut him every time he thought about it. The doctors had warned him her body was failing, that no matter how much money or effort had been poured into her treatment, her strength had been depleted beyond recovery. But hearing those words, and living through the moment, were two entirely different things. The apartment, which had once been filled with quiet warmth, now carried the weight of impending loss. Margaret lay on her bed, pale and fragile, her breathing shallow but steady, while Emily sat by her side, gripping her mother's hand with a determination no child should ever have to summon. Michel had been there since dawn, sitting silently in a chair too small for the moment's enormity, his eyes never leaving Emily as she read from one of her books. Her voice trembled with each word, breaking on the difficult sentences, but she continued, determined to make her mother feel her presence in this final moment. When Emily couldn't continue, her tears flowing freely, Michel quietly took the book from her hands and began to read aloud, his deep voice carrying the words across the room while Margaret's faint smile lingered. Michel, a man accustomed to speaking in boardrooms filled with hard-nosed negotiators, had never felt so vulnerable as when reading those simple words, knowing they might be the last Margaret would hear. Hours passed, and Margaret, her strength nearly gone, managed to turn her gaze toward him. Though her eyes were dim with exhaustion, they still held an intensity that pierced him. With a whisper, barely audible, she asked him to promise that Emily would never be abandoned, that she would not face the indifference of the world alone. Margaret spoke of Emily's strength, but as a mother, she knew that even the strongest child needed someone to protect her, to guide her, to ensure she would not be left to navigate life's struggles alone. Michel, his throat tightening, took Margaret's frail hand in both of his and swore to her that Emily would always have someone to rely on, that he would not just provide for her, but love her in the way a true parent should. Margaret's lips curled into the faintest of smiles, and her eyes softened. It was as if, in that moment, she could finally let go of the burden she had carried alone for so long. Later that evening, as the light faded and the apartment grew quiet, Margaret took one final breath and passed away. The silence that filled the room after her death was deafening. Emily let out a broken cry, collapsing against her mother's still body, her small frame shaking with grief. Michel moved to her side, pulling the little girl gently into his arms. She resisted at first, clinging to her mother as though her presence alone could bring her back, but eventually, she gave in, sobbing uncontrollably into his chest. He held her tightly, his hand gently stroking her hair. His own eyes burned with unshed tears. He had faced down billion-dollar deals, betrayal, even threats to his life, but nothing had ever hurt as much as holding this little girl in the wake of the loss she had just endured. The following days were a blur of decisions and arrangements. Michel took care of the funeral himself, ensuring that Margaret was laid to rest with dignity, sparing Emily from the harsh logistics of the process that no child should ever have to bear. The ceremony was small and quiet, attended only by a few acquaintances and colleagues from the hotel. Emily clung to his side the entire time, her red, swollen eyes fixed on the casket. Michelle never left her side, whispering comforting words to her as she endured the moment, her face pale with grief. To outsiders, it may have seemed strange to see the untouchable CEO of a billion-dollar empire kneeling beside a grieving child at such a modest affair. But Michelle didn't care what they thought. In that moment, Emily was all that mattered. Not long after, social services reached out, their approach clinical and detached, discussing procedures, foster systems, and temporary placements. They suggested the possibility of Emily being placed with a family already approved by the state. Michelle listened in silence, then cut through the room with a voice that left no room for argument. He told them, flatly and with finality, that Emily was already with her family, that she was under his protection, and that no system or court would take her from him. The officials tried to protest, citing legal complications and public scrutiny, but Michelle's expression hardened. He had fought and won battles with ruthless competitors in boardrooms. This time, he would fight harder than he had ever fought for profit. The legal battle began almost immediately, and the media swarmed the story. Reporters camped outside his offices, demanding answers. Was this a publicity stunt? A hidden scandal? Michelle ignored it all. For the first time in his career, he didn't care how the world perceived him. What mattered was Emily's well-being, and she needed him there, unwavering and steady, through every hearing, every challenge. At night, Emily still woke from nightmares, calling out for her mother in a broken voice. Every time, Michelle was there, sitting by her bed, holding her hand until her breathing steadied and she drifted back into an uneasy sleep. Slowly, cautiously, she began to lean on him, testing his promises. Each time he proved himself, her trust deepened. When the court granted him temporary custody, the media exploded with headlines. Michelle barely noticed. What mattered to him was that Emily now lived under his roof, no longer surrounded by fear and loneliness but by a home where she was seen, where she was cared for. Her grief was still raw, still heavy, but there were small, fleeting moments when she smiled or even laughed, that told Michelle that she was healing, slowly but surely. In those moments, Michelle felt something stir inside him, something he had thought long dead. A tenderness, a protective instinct, something far more valuable than anything he had ever fought for in his corporate empire. And as Emily began to let go of her fear, Michelle knew that the journey ahead would not be easy. But he would face it with her, because he had made a promise he would never break. In the year that followed, Michel found himself experiencing a life he could have never predicted. The grief that still lingered in the corners of his heart was there, like a shadow, but it slowly began to fade as the contours of a new life began to take shape. His once cold, echoing penthouse, the place where he had always retreated to escape the world's demands, had been transformed by the presence of a child. The toys scattered across the floor, the drawings taped proudly to the refrigerator, and the sound of footsteps, belonging not to staff, but to Emily herself, now filled the space. The sleek marble and glass were still there, but now they coexisted with traces of life and warmth, the kind that no amount of wealth could purchase, but which Michel had come to realize was more valuable than all his success. Emily had grown stronger, her laughter, once tentative and filled with uncertainty, had gradually become more frequent, more natural. She began to speak freely about her school days, her friends, her teachers, and the adventures she had. She filled sketchbooks with drawings, many of which featured him. Sometimes he was holding her hand, sometimes just standing nearby as a silent protector in her imaginative world. Each drawing was a small testament to the promise he had kept, the promise that he would always be there for her, that he would not be another adult who would disappear when life got hard. The first time she called him Dad, it was a casual request for help with a school project. The word fell from her lips without hesitation, and for Michel, it felt like a force more powerful than any accolade he had ever received. He responded without thinking, without missing a beat. Later that night, as he stood by her door watching her sleep, the sound of that single word echoed in his mind, settling something deep inside him. It was as though a part of him, a part he had never known was missing, had finally been restored. His colleagues began to notice the changes in him, though few dared to speak of it directly. He no longer stayed late in the office, no longer treated every negotiation as though it were a life-or-death decision. His focus was still razor-sharp, his business instincts as ruthless as ever, but his priorities had shifted. He started turning down events, cutting short business trips, insisting on being home for dinners, and attending school recitals. Some whispered that he was softening, that his edge had dulled. But Michel knew the truth. He was not weaker, he was stronger. He was anchored now, not by the unyielding pursuit of profit, but by something far more enduring, the love and trust of the child who had saved him. For the first time in his life, Michel did not measure success by contracts signed or deals made. Instead, he measured it by the small moments that made up his new life, the smile on Emily's face when she saw him at the end of each day, the way her eyes lit up when they spent time together, the way her laughter filled the air around him. The legal battles were finally over, and Emily was officially his daughter, legally, in the eyes of the law. The ceremony was a quiet, unassuming event held in a small courtroom, but for Michel, it was unnecessary. The bond had already been sealed in 1,000 small, unspoken moments, the nights he spent awake comforting her after nightmares, the mornings he clumsily packed her school lunch, the afternoons spent listening to her chatter about school, pretending to understand everything, just to see her excitement. When the judge announced that the adoption was final, Michel felt a wave of relief wash over him, not for himself, but for Emily. He could see it in her eyes, she finally had the certainty that no one could take her away again. As they left the courtroom, Emily squeezed his hand tightly and whispered, "Thank you." Though the words were small, they carried the weight of everything she had endured and everything she now believed in. In that moment, Michel knew that his life had forever changed, and that Emily was no longer just a child he had promised to protect, she was his daughter in every sense of the word. Their life together became filled with small, sacred traditions that would have seemed mundane to anyone on the outside but were treasures to them. On Sundays, they would cook breakfast together, often ending with flour dusting the counters and eggs spilling onto the floor. Michel would laugh more on those mornings than he ever had in his years of business victories. In the evenings, they would sit side by side, reading. Emily would curl up against him with a book, while Michel pretended to focus on his papers, but secretly, he found himself more interested in watching the way her lips moved as she read aloud. On the anniversary of the day Emily had saved his life in that hotel, they released a balloon into the sky, a note tied to it. Emily's note that year read, "We are a family now." Michel stood beside her on the balcony, watching as the balloon disappeared into the clouds, his chest heavy with emotions he no longer tried to hide. The world outside still speculated, and reporters occasionally tried to spin their story into a headline, but Michel no longer cared. He had spent his entire life chasing power and reputation, guarding himself against vulnerability. But now, he understood that vulnerability was not weakness. It was the courage to love, to protect, to be seen, not as an untouchable figure, but as a man who could kneel beside a child and promise that she would never be alone again. Emily had given him that gift, and in return, he had given her the one thing she needed most, stability, love, and a place to belong. One evening, as they sat together on the penthouse balcony, watching the city lights glitter below, Emily leaned her head against his arm and whispered, "I'm happy." It was such a simple statement, spoken without any flair or drama, but to Michel, it was more powerful than any declaration he had ever heard in his life. He turned to look at her, her blonde hair catching the glow of the city, her blue eyes bright with trust. And in that moment, Michel realized that his greatest achievement was not the empire he had built. It was the family he had found. The man who had once been defined by wealth and power, who had lived in a world of cold calculations and untouchable success, was now something else entirely. He was a father. And in that role, Michel had discovered the only legacy that truly mattered.